Have you ever wondered, does God exist? Have you ever looked at the world around you and thought to yourself, was this created or evolved? Are rocks really millions of years old? Did dinosaurs roam the world not too long ago? Is there evidence for a worldwide global flood? Is the Bible reliable? Is it accurate? Is it true? Join us now for this exciting episode of The Evidence. Tonight, we take a turn into a new field of science, archaeology. Tonight, we're going to travel into ancient tombs, ancient cities, and ancient texts to test the reliability of one of the best-selling books on the planet, the Bible. The Bible is one of the most translated and widespread books ever written. Although it is one of the best-selling books in history, it has also been one of the most controversial books in history. One of the reasons that the Bible has been so controversial is because it claims God as its author. In 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 16, it says, all Scripture is given by inspiration of God. The Bible claims to be of divine origin. It also claims that God inspired 40 different authors who all came from different backgrounds to write the 66 books you find in the Bible. And they wrote it over a 2,000-year period. In 2 Peter 1, verse 21, it tells us that holy men of God spoke as they were moved or inspired by God or by the Holy Spirit. Critics of the Bible paint a very different picture of where the Bible came from. Instead, they propose that the Bible originated through an evolutionary process. Yes, evolution describes more than science. Evolution can also be used to describe religion as well. According to Richard Dawkins, in The God Delusion, he says, creative intelligences being evolved necessarily arrive late in the universe and therefore cannot be responsible for designing it. God, in the sense defined, is a delusion, a pernicious delusion. According to Dawkins, how you arrive at this is you have the single-celled organism that gradually develops into a multi-celled, complex organism until you get to humans, and eventually humans come up with the idea of religion and God. So it's just the opposite of what the Bible would say. The Bible would say everything was created by God, and the evolutionary process would say that God is created by everything else. So it's just the opposite. And according to the evolutionary theory, mythologies, miracles, all of those things crept into the Bible over thousands of years. The man who made this popular was Julius Wellhausen. In 1878, he studied the first 5 books of the Bible. The first 5 books of the Bible are called the Torah. That's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Torah is the Hebrew word for law. He suggested that the Bible was actually written 1,000 years after the events had taken place. And the reason he said that is to allow for long periods of time for myths and legends to creep into the text so that the stories we have today really are nothing like the stories actually went when they actually happened. This was all according to Julius Wellhausen, and he said the Genesis, the first part of the Bible, was probably written between 850 to 550 BC. I'd like to illustrate this for you. Here you have a man. His name is John. John likes to fish. One day, John came home and he told a true story. He said, I caught a fish. But as John told that story over time, by the next year, the fish got a little bigger. Now John caught a big fish. And by the next year, it wasn't a big fish, it was a huge fish. Eventually, John's story was he caught a whale. That's how Wellhausen pictured the Bible. Filled with mythology, filled with errors, and only fractions of the true story remain. And all of this crept into the Bible over thousands or over 1,000 years. So time was the main point for Wellhausen. Too much time had passed between when the events took place and when the Bible was written, and people just made stuff up. Well, archaeologists have different time periods for human beings, and they date these or name these time periods based on the type of tools that human beings were using at these times. The first time period, or the earliest, is called the Stone Age, a time when humans used stone tools, and it represents everything before 3000 BC. The next time period is called the Bronze Age, when humans began to use metal tools, and it represents between 3000 and 1000 BC. The Bronze Age is broken up into early bronze, middle bronze, and late Bronze Age. The Iron Age is when they began to use iron tools. It represents between 1200 and 600 BC, and just like the Bronze Age, it has early Iron Age, middle Iron Age, and late Iron Age periods. Wellhausen said that the Bible would have been written in the Iron Age, sometime between 1200 and 600 BC. This is when Wellhausen said that the Bible had to have been written, about 1,000 years after the events. The events actually occurred during the Bronze Age, and if the Bible is accurate, then it should have been written during the Bronze Age. And not just the Bronze Age, it should have been written during the Middle Bronze Age, which is about 2000 to 1700 BC. So when we look at archaeology, we're looking at archaeological artifacts that confirm the Bible, and those artifacts should date to the Middle Bronze Age period if the Bible is correct, if it was written at the same time that the events took place. Wellhausen said, no, 1,000 years later, 850 to 550 BC in the Iron Age. That's when it was written. So the big question is, when was the Bible actually written? And probably the question behind that question is the Bible accurate? Is it reliable? Is it trustworthy? So we're going to be looking at these questions. And first we'll be looking at the biblical test of time. Do the customs, the names, and the prices mentioned in the Bible match the time period 2000s to 1700 BC? That's the middle what? The Middle Bronze Age. So we're looking for the Middle Bronze Age to match customs, names, and prices. We're also going to be looking for accuracy. We should be able to see that there are archaeological evidence for the existence of biblical people, biblical places, and evidence that biblical events actually took place. For instance, if you came across a document and that document said that it was written in 1700, you would not expect to find the author writing about helicopters, right? Because he shouldn't know anything about helicopters in 1700 unless, maybe he was describing being picked up by a UFO or something, I don't know. But you shouldn't find helicopters mentioned anywhere in a 1700 text. If you do, you know it's not a text from the 1700s. Instead, you would expect to see horse-drawn carriages or something like that written in the text. We're going to be looking for the same things in the Bible. We're going to be looking for elements in the biblical text that match the time period. We're going to look at social customs, prices, biblical people, biblical places, biblical events, and supposed inconsistencies in the biblical text. So are you ready? Let's start with Genesis. The events of Genesis were supposed to have been written between 2000 and 1700 BC. That's the Middle Bronze. Middle Bronze. We'll remember by the end. Middle Bronze Age. One of the first things that you see in Genesis is that the covenants or the contracts that are written in Genesis match the contracts found in archaeological tablets and stone structures that have been written on at that time. A covenant is an agreement, usually a formal agreement between two or more persons to do or not do something specified. It could be the sale of property, or it could simply be a promise that two people are making to one another, like wedding vows. Covenants have a certain number of elements, and at different time periods, those elements change. I'll give you an example here. In Genesis 21, 23 through 32, there's a covenant that's recorded. This is how the covenant reads. Now, therefore, swear to me by who? By God, that you will not deal falsely with me, with my offspring, or with my posterity. There you see a witness and then a stipulation made in the covenant. Then it goes on to say, but that according to the kindness that I have done to you, you will do to me and to the land in which I have dwelt. And Abraham said, I what? I swear. And that's the oath in the covenant. And he said, you will take these 7 ewe lambs from my hand, that they may be my witness that I have dug this well. And that's a ceremony that's put into the covenant. So how many elements are in this covenant here? There's 4. By the time you get to the late Bronze Age, you don't have 4, you have 7. The Middle Bronze Age has 4 to 5 elements in the covenants that are written. Here's an Akkadian tablet found in Syria, dated to 1800 BC. That's important because 1800 BC is the Middle Bronze Age, when the events in the Bible should have taken place. They discovered ordinary covenants or contracts between people on these tablets, and they found lots of these tablets, all written in cuneiform. Little tablets, bigger tablets, some of them broken apart, some of them in whole pieces, but lots and lots of covenants that they could study. One of the tablets is actually called the Mari tablet, and the Mari tablet is from the city of Mari, which is right about the place where Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and some of the biblical characters in Genesis lived and worked. So these tablets that were written so close to where the biblical characters lived match the customs of those biblical characters. All of these tablets contain only 4 or 5 elements in the contracts or in the covenants. There's a witness, usually a deity, an oath, a stipulation, a ceremony, and then sometimes there's a curse. So the covenants match. Another thing that matches is the social customs of the time. Social customs during the Middle Bronze Age match biblical customs. According to Genesis, one of the social customs that you find is that the right of the firstborn is always given to the son of a man's wife. Now, this may not necessarily be the firstborn son. Sometimes the firstborn son is the firstborn son with a concubine, or with a servant or a slave, or not a married spouse. But the firstborn right is given to the first son of the man's first wife. You'll see that in Genesis 21, verse 10. It says, therefore she said to Abraham, Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, namely with Isaac. Well, archaeologists have uncovered something called the Code of Hammurabi. It dates to 1754 BC. It was uncovered by Egyptologist Gustave Jacquier in 1901, and it contains all the laws and customs of the time, all written down, one law at a time. Now, if you go to law number 171, written on this stela, it says, if, however, the father, while still living, did not say to the sons of the maidservant, my sons, and then the father dies, then the sons of the maidservant shall not share with the sons of the wife, but the freedom of the maid and her sons shall be granted. So here we have a social custom written in the Bible and a social custom written in an archaeological stele, the Code of Hammurabi, that match. And the Code of Hammurabi dates to the exact time period, the Middle Bronze Age, when the events of the Bible were supposed to take place. Now, here's something amazing. If you look at slave prices or the prices of anything, bread or milk or cheese or whatever it is, inflates over time. 100 years ago, you'd expect everything to be cheaper than it is today, right? And it works that way in the Bible. In the Bible, you have slave prices of 3 different characters. You have Joseph. In the books of Moses, it mentions it. And also in 2 Kings, Menahem also mentions the slave prices. Archaeologists have discovered slave prices written in different tablets and in different stelae down through time that continue to inflate as the artifacts get younger and younger. So let's look at Joseph first. Joseph was said in Genesis 37, verse 28, to be sold as a slave. And this is what it says. Then Midianite traders passed by, so the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for how much? 20 shekels of silver, sold, and they took him to Egypt. The Code of Hammurabi, 1754, mentions that the price of a slave is 20 shekels of silver. Exactly what the Bible said the price of a slave would be in the Middle Bronze Age period. The price matches. But it doesn't just match once. It matches over and over again. Take Moses, for example. In Exodus 21:32, he wrote a law. And the law says, if an ox gores a male or female servant, the owner of the ox shall give to their master how much? 30 shekels of silver. Now, why 30 shekels of silver? Because that was the price of a servant or a slave at that time. 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. Archaeologists found Nuzi written in 1400 BC, and it describes that a slave was exactly the same price, 30 shekels of silver, the same time period that Moses and the Israelites should have been wandering together in the wilderness. Now, the third example from the Bible is Menahem, and Menahem comes much later in the Bible. It's found in 2 Kings 15:20, and it says, and Menahem exacted the money from Israel, from all the very wealthy, from each man 50 shekels of silver, to give to the king of Assyria. So the king of Assyria turned back and did not stay there in the land. So each man was worth how much? 50 shekels of silver by this time. And that's exactly what we find. In Assyria in 750 BC, a slave was sold for 50 shekels of silver. In Persia, in 400 BC, the slave price was now up to 80 shekels of silver. Now, what happens if instead of using the biblical dates, we use Wellhausen's dates, 1,000 years later? What would the graphs look like then? Well, here's the graphs. You have the archaeological dates or the archaeological prices as they're recorded there with the yellow line. And then the orange line is Wellhausen's dates for the archaeological prices for Joseph and for Moses. So you can see that Wellhausen's dates are way off. Another thing that changes down through time is people's names. Archaeologists have discovered things called scarabs, and scarabs are like a personal seal. On one side of the scarab, and Egypt was littered with these, on one side of the scarab is something that looks like a beetle. That's the top part of the scarab. The bottom part of the scarab is flat. And on that flat part on the bottom, they inscribe their own personal name. And then they use this scarab to give their signature on documents or their signature on clay tablets or whatever they need to put their signature in. Egyptians used to use scarab rings. People used to have these little scarab rocks they'd put in their pocket. I'd like my own scarab. How about you? Well, the style of the most popular names in the Middle Bronze Age were names that began with J or I, such as Jacob or Joseph or Joshua or Ishmael. These are all called Amorite imperfectives. What they've discovered is that the popularity of names decreases with age. In the Middle Bronze Age, 16% of all names started with J or I. In the Late Bronze Age, only 4%. And by the time you get to the Iron Age, you only have 2% of names that start with J or I. There's other names that they found that match the names in Genesis and in the Old Testament. On clay tablets, they found names such as Abraham, Abram, Abruhana, Abrama, Israel, Esau, Job, Zebulanu, Noah, Laban, Jacob. I mean, does anybody else think these are some weird names? I've read through the Bible and I've looked at these different names and I've thought to myself, man, these are some strange names. I can't even say some of them. But there they are, written in the Bible, and not just written in the Bible, written in clay tablets, written in scarabs, written in stone, dating to the exact same time that the Bible writers were writing. These aren't names that somebody just made up. These were the popular names of the time. Egyptian texts, Dilbat tablets, Mari tablets, and Ebla tablets all confirm the names written in the Bible. Now, my great-grandmother's name was Beulah. Beulah would have been a good name 100 years ago. But today, you aren't going to find very many kids in the hospital being named Beulah, are you? Because the name Beulah, over 100 years, has lost its popularity. And the same thing is true in the Bible. So the fact that they have found these names in archaeological stones and texts means that it matches. And these stones and texts are from the Middle Bronze Age, just as the Bible mentions. They've also found different cities and places. The temple that you're looking at is the Ziggurat Temple at Ur. This thing's incredible. As you're going up these stairs, it looks like, literally like you're going to heaven, like the staircase to heaven. United States soldiers have walked up this ziggurat. They used to have ziggurats in Babylon. These were what the temples looked like in Babylon. But they've found cities such as Ur, Haran, Hebron, Sodom, Gomorrah, Laish, Salem, Shechem. All of them appear in both the Bible and Middle Bronze Age texts. Here's a gate called the Gate at Laish, also known as Tel Dan. This gate dates to 1750 BC, which is Middle Bronze Age. It was first identified by archaeologist Edwin Robinson in 1838. In Genesis 14, verse 14, it says that Abraham visited this city and probably walk through this very gate when he went to rescue Lot. So this could have been a gate that Abraham himself walked through. There are other cities that they found. Hebron is one city. Archaeological excavation revealed traces of strong fortifications dated to the early Bronze Age in the area that the Bible says would be Hebron. Genesis 13:8 says, "Then Abraham moved his tent and dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, which are in Hebron." They've also found Haran. The earliest records of Haran come from the Ebla tablets, dating to 2300 BC. And in Genesis 12:4, it mentions that Abraham, when he was 75 years old, departed from Haran. Anachronisms are things that scientists or scholars sometimes claim to have found in the Bible. An anachronism is a supposed discrepancy in the biblical text. For instance, for years, scholars believed that camels weren't used for transport and weren't domesticated until 1000 BC. But Genesis mentions that these camels were used regularly as domesticated animals long before, about 1,000 years before 1000 BC. This is a supposed example of a biblical oops, like that 1700 document. If somebody were to write in and we saw helicopters, that would be a whoops, a dead giveaway. This isn't a 1700 document, right? So in Genesis 24:32, it says, "And he unloaded the camels," which should be a dead giveaway that this is not written when it says it was supposed to be written. But in the 1920s, in Cairo, Egypt, archaeologists discovered a rope. Can you guess what the rope was made of? Camel's hair. They sent the rope to the Natural History Museum and dated it between 2686 BC and 2498 BC. Now, how do you get a camel to sit down long enough for you to braid its hair into a rope and cut it off? I don't know, maybe camels listened well back then. But they also found rock etching in Wadi Nasib, Sinai, discovered and dated to 2200 BC. This rock etching shows an Egyptian man leading a camel by a rope. And it's dated to 2200 BC. Now, when did scholars say camels, the earliest camels were domesticated? 1000 BC. This is 1200 years before that. And it's found in a rock etching in Wadi Nasib. Then they found a Bactrian camel, which is a camel that has two humps, a statue of a Bactrian camel. And the amazing thing about this camel wasn't that it had two humps, but it had a harness. And it dated to 2000 BC. Now, a camel with a harness is a domesticated camel, or a camel that you're dragging somewhere, right? So here's another biblical match. Archaeology proves the Bible right, and in this case, proves the historians wrong. What about the events in Exodus, such as Israel's slavery in Egypt? The story of the Exodus states that the Jewish nation was in bondage in Egypt for years, for about 400 years. And if the Israelites were in bondage in Egypt for about 400 years, you should find evidence that Israel was in Egypt. You should find evidence that Israel left Egypt. And so we're going to look at the archaeological evidence for Israel being in Egypt. Now, the date that Israel left Egypt is 1446 BC. That is when they should have left Egypt. And we know that because the Bible states that the Exodus took place 480 years before Solomon began to build the temple. And it mentions when Solomon built the temple, so we go back 480 years and we come to the year 1446. So that's when they were supposed to have exited from Egypt. So Exodus is the second book in the Old Testament. It records the story of the Israelite slaves in Egypt and their miraculous freedom from slavery. This is what the Bible says. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt. So I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up to a good and large land. In Exodus 12, verse 51, it says that the children of Israel came out of the land of Egypt. That was supposed to be 1446. So is there evidence that the Israelites were slaves in Egypt? Let's look at that evidence. The first evidence you find that the Israelites were in Egypt comes from the tomb of Rechmire. In the tomb of Rechmire, which dates to the 1500s BC, there's a wall mural dated to the 1500s BC. In the wall mural, you can see paintings of people with Semitic features. Not only in the tomb of Rechmire, but in other texts, such as the Louvre leather roll and the papyrus Anastasi III, all describe Semitic slaves as builders and brickmasters with a quota to fulfill under the command of taskmasters. This wall mural and other wall murals depict Semitic-looking individuals in Egypt. Now look at this mural. Is there a difference between some of the people in this mural? First of all, look at what this guy's wearing. Is that a little bit different than what this guy's wearing? One is a picture of an Egyptian. The other is a picture of an Israelite. And you can see the Israelite garb coming up over one shoulder and having one shoulder and one arm bare. Another thing that's a giveaway is that the Egyptians would not handle livestock. The Israelites handled livestock. And you see in this picture the Israelites handling goats and some of the desert deer or sheep out there. In Exodus 1, verse 11, it says that the Egyptians appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor, and they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. In Papyri Leningrad 1116a, I don't know why they have to give these documents such crazy names, but this document dates to 1800 BC. It records the building of public projects by Semitic slaves. The Israelites were Semitic. So this is evidence that perhaps that the Israelites were the Semitic slaves there in Egypt. Another giveaway is in 1966, there was an excavation in the land of Goshen by the archaeologist Manfred Bietek. When he excavated the area, he discovered distinctively Israelite four-room pillared house plans. Nothing excavated in this village was Egyptian, although it was dug up in Egypt. They also found 20% of the pottery was Palestinian Middle Bronze Age type, not Egyptian. And the simple four-bedroom house was the most common type of Israelite house from the time period of King David to the Babylonian captivity. It wasn't an Egyptian type of house. Archaeologists have also discovered slave records in Egyptian households. This one's called the Brooklyn Papyrus, and it dates to 1740 BC. In this Brooklyn Papyrus, there are 77 slave names. 30 of those names are Semitic Hebrew names, such as Shipra, Menahem, feminine forms of Issachar, Asher, Akab, related to Jacob. So we've seen some pretty compelling evidence that the Israelites were indeed slaves in Egypt. But what about the time? What about the timing of their slavery? Is the Bible accurate when it pinpoints 1446 BC as the time of the Exodus? Is there evidence that the Israelites wandered in the wilderness for 40 years? Is there evidence that they conquered the tribes as they entered into Canaan? In Exodus 16:35, it says, "And the children of Israel ate manna for how long?" For 40 years. So if they exited from Egypt in 1446 BC, it means you should find them entering Canaan about 1406 BC, 40 years later. Is there evidence for this date? Well, there is. It's called the Amarna letters. The Amarna letters are 14th century tablets, and they referred to raids upon Canaanite cities by a nomadic group called the Habiru. Now, who is this nomadic group called the Habiru? It sounds very close to the Israelites' other name, Hebrew. And we find the mention of the Habiru invasion over and over and over again throughout all of these clay tablets. By the way, these clay tablets were a correspondence between Egyptian administration and representatives in the land of Canaan, and it dated to 1400 BC. Then you come to what archaeologists discovered, which is called the Merneptah Stela. The Merneptah Stela records an attack on areas in Canaan by Pharaoh Merneptah. And the attacks happened in 1209 BC. That's 200 years after the Israelites should already be in the land of Canaan. It was discovered by Flinders Petrie of Thebes in 1896, and it mentions Canaan as a land with 3 cities, Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yanoam, within the land. It also mentions the people of Israel in the land in 1209 BC. It's the earliest extra-biblical reference to the nation of Israel and dates to the 13th century. It implies that Israel was a dominant nation in Canaan by 1209 BC, which means that they had to have come into Canaan before 1209 BC. When were they supposed to come into Canaan? 1406, 200 years earlier. So they must have been established for some time to be a main enemy of Egypt 200 years later. If the Habiru are really the Israelites, then you have evidence that Israel entered in the 14th century BC. Now, another thing we find is there's evidence that the Israelites wandered in the wilderness. This is one of the most incredible finds in archaeology. It's an inscription that was uncovered on one of the pillars of an ancient Egyptian temple dated to 1400 BC. What did the inscription say? It says, Tashasu Yahweh, land of the nomads of Yahweh. It's the Soleb temple dated to 1400 BC. Now here's the question. Yahweh is the name of the Israelite God. What is an Israelite God doing on an Egyptian temple? Well, land of the nomads of Yahweh. We know that earlier there were records in Egyptian texts, the Amarna letters, which talk about the nomads called the Habiru that were coming through. And now we find in an Egyptian temple, the nomads have a god, and their god's name is Yahweh, which is the same name for the Hebrew God, Yahweh. Donald Redford, an Egyptologist, says, for half a century, it has been generally admitted that we have here the Tetragrammaton, the name of the Israelite God, Yahweh. And if this be the case, as it undoubtedly is, the passage constitutes the most precious indication of the whereabouts during the late 15th century BC of an enclave revering this God. Well, what about the evidence for the conquest of Canaan? Did the Israelites destroy and drive out the nations as the Bible records? Well, let's go to Numbers 33, 50 through 53. It says that they came to a city, and the first city they came to was the city of Jericho. And there in this record it says, destroy all their molded images and demolish all their high places. Now the reason that God called the Israelites to destroy not only Jericho but all of the Canaanites is because the Canaanites were offering their children as sacrifices to their idols. One of the favorite idols of the Canaanites was an idol called Molech. And Molech had the head of a bull and the body of a man and sat on a throne with his arms straight out. He was made of complete metal and was hollow on the inside. They would stuff Molech in his back with fire, and they would heat him up until his arms were red hot. And then the Canaanite parents would come with their children and put their children in the hands of Molech. Now let me ask you, what would happen to those people if they did this in Texas today? Death penalty. Would you agree? So in God calling the Israelites to exterminate the Canaanites, he wasn't calling them to do anything unfair or unjust. God was ridding that area of the pain and the suffering that had so deeply entrenched the land of Canaan. The very first place that is mentioned in the Bible as being destroyed by the Israelites is the ancient city of Jericho. It has been excavated in the early 1900s through the 1930s and through the 1950s. In all the excavations, they've discovered that the city of Jericho shows signs of being destroyed. No matter where you look, there's destruction, evidence of destruction throughout Jericho. And the evidence is quite fascinating. In Joshua 2:15, it describes Jericho in a very unique way. It says that there's a lady who has a house, and her house is part of the wall. Now, how in the world was her house part of the wall of Jericho? Well, this was a puzzle to some archaeologists until they uncovered Jericho, and they found out that Jericho has two walls. It's up on a hill, and it has a lower wall down at the bottom of the hill, and a little way up the hill, it has a second wall. And between the two walls, there's a plastered rampart, and between the two walls, they built houses. And these houses were built all around in between the two walls. And this was built for safety, so that if raiders came and sieged, everybody could run into the first wall, into their houses. And if the first wall was breached, they could go into the core of the city and be behind a second wall. It's exactly how the Bible mentions Jericho. Jericho had two walls. In between the two walls, they built houses. Archaeologists also discovered something very interesting about the walls of Jericho. In a normal siege, when an army surrounds a city, they have big battering rams, and they bang, and they bang, and they bang the walls in. But the walls on Jericho didn't fall in. The walls on Jericho all fell out. And because the walls fell out on Jericho, it created a natural ramp that the army could go up into Jericho. Notice what the Bible says in Joshua 6, verse 20. So the people shouted when the priests blew the trumpets, and it happened when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down flat. Then the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. Now notice what it says in Joshua 3, verse 15 about the time period that the city of Jericho was taken. It says, and as those who bore the ark came to the Jordan, and the feet of the priests who bore the ark dipped into the edge of the water, for the Jordan overflows all its banks during the whole time of what? Of the harvest time. Jericho was taken during the harvest time. And then after it was taken, it says they burned the city with fire, of course. When John Garstang excavated Jericho, he found full jars of grain that were charred from the fire. Those full jars of grain mean that a recent harvest had taken place. The fact that the jars were full means that whoever destroyed the city left the grain and didn't take it as spoil. And the fact that the jars of grain were charred means that the city was burned with fire once it had been destroyed, which matches the account of Jericho's destruction in the Bible perfectly. Another thing that they found in Jericho was Cypriot pottery. Cypriot pottery was a special type of pottery that was popular during the 14th century BC, which is the exact time period when the Israelites should have been coming in and overtaking the land of Canaan. There's other evidences of Israel coming through. Archaeologists have confirmed that Hazor was destroyed by fire, just as Joshua 11 describes. They have discovered Egyptian and Canaanite idols with their heads cut off, just as God instructed Israel to do, and evidence of Shechem being given to the Habiru tribe in the Amarna letters, just as Joshua 8 describes. So now we're going to move to the kings of Israel, and we're going to start with the most popular king of Israel, King David. David is probably the most well-known king of Israel, but there's been question about whether he even existed. By this time, Israel is now well established in the land of Canaan. There are around 520 different settlements, and David should have existed around 1000 BC. So this is the time period we should be seeing David come on the scene. Did David exist? Well, Kathleen Kenyon excavated in 1960 a part of Jerusalem and discovered a stepstone structure on the side of the Kidron Valley. Inside of it, she found a number of Israelite four-room houses. So it looked somewhat like a complex. On the same hill, another archaeologist by the name of Eliot Mazar discovered a huge stone wall, 22 feet thick. And he followed this wall for over 30 meters or more than 90 feet. This structure is connected to the stone step structure that Kathleen Kenyon first found. And now they've discovered that this is the largest Iron Age structure in all of Israel. And many believe that this was the palace of King David. An ashlar block was discovered on this stone step structure by Kathleen Kenyon. And ashlar blocks came from a city called Tyre. Tyre was a city in the country of Phoenicia. So Tyre was really a Phoenician city, and these stone blocks were made by the Phoenicians and transported down here to this structure. The pottery around this structure all dates to 900 to 1000 BC. The interesting thing is that the Bible tells us that King David, or Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David with cedar trees, carpenters, and stonemasons. And they built the house for David. So where did the stones come from for David's house? From Tyre, or Phoenicia. These were Phoenician ashlar blocks found here in what many believe is David's palace. David was king at the time that the pottery in this area dates to. Another thing that they discovered is in the Elah Valley between Jerusalem and Gaza, archaeologists uncovered a huge wall, 700 meters in length, with no city inside of it. It appears to be a military fortress. It also doesn't appear to be Philistine because the pottery nearby and the lack of any pig bones indicates this must be an Israelite fortress. It's a two-gate fortress called Sharaim, which means two gates, and it's mentioned in Joshua 15, Samuel 17, and 1 Chronicles 4, and it fits the place mentioned during the time of David. Another exciting find is an ostrakhan, which is a curved piece of pottery that has some inscription on it. It's the oldest Hebrew inscription ever found, and it dates to 1000 BC. On that inscription, it mentions do not do, judge, slave, and king. Obviously, Israel had a king in 1000 BC. Perhaps it's King David. Then they found the Tel Dan Stela. It's discovered in northern Israel, dates to the mid-9th century. It mentions Beth David, which means house of David. This was a popular phrase used of kings who had a lineage of kings that came after them. It was used by the Assyrians, it was used by the Babylonians, and it was used here by the Israelites. And then they found the Mesha Stela. The Mesha Stela is known as the Moabite stone. It's inscribed in 850 BC, and in line 31 of the Mesha Stela, it mentions House of David. Was King David, a real king? It appears so. Then we have the wall relief of Shoshank I. It's transliterated Hadabiet Dawit, which literally means the heights of David. Shoshank I was a pharaoh that had invaded Israel and would have been aware of David. And here he mentions the heights of David. Perhaps the place where David hid as a fugitive from Saul. Here's the only known picture of an Israelite king anywhere. It's of King Jehu, and he's bowing down to the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III and kissing his feet. He's right there. And it's recorded boastfully on the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, boasting of Israel's king bowing down before Shalmaneser, the Assyrian king. So now we come to the Assyrian conquest. The Assyrian conquest is mentioned at the end of the Old Testament, and it's also mentioned by archaeological writers from Assyria. In 732, the Assyrians invaded the northern kingdom of Israel, and you can find that in 2 Kings 17. 10 years later, in 722 BC, Israel had been defeated, and King Hoshea had been taken captive to Assyria. In about 701 BC, the Assyrians move on to attack the southern kingdom of Judah, ruled by Hezekiah. As they come through, they take one city after another city after another city. Hezekiah hears them coming, and he begins to make plans. Before the Assyrians get there to siege Jerusalem, Hezekiah orders that all of the springs be stopped up so that when the Assyrians come, they won't have any water to drink. They'll have marched a long time, been very thirsty. They come to the walls of Jerusalem, and there will be no water for them. And then Hezekiah has a rush tunnel built. He has tunnelers build from both directions, and amazingly, they meet in the middle with just a few inches on either side's mist. So they come through. You can walk through this tunnel today. It's called Hezekiah's Tunnel, and he diverted water through this tunnel underneath Jerusalem so that Jerusalem would still have plenty of water during the siege. Now, the interesting thing is that in Sennacherib's prism, which records King Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, coming against Jerusalem, he mentions Hezekiah by name. And he mentions how he came up against the city of Jerusalem. In 2 Kings 18, it mentions what Hezekiah did as King Sennacherib is coming up against him. It says that Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the house of the Lord. The interesting thing is that Sennacherib's prism says the exact same thing as the Bible. It says, Hezekiah there felt the fear of the power of my arms, and he sent out to me the chiefs and the elders of Jerusalem with 30 talents of gold and 800 talents of silver and diverse treasures. In 2 Kings, it tells the story that Sennacherib came up to the city of Jerusalem, went to destroy it, but was not able to defeat Jerusalem, and for some mysterious reason went back to Assyria. The real interesting thing is that when you read Sennacherib's account, you find him mentioning every city that he defeats in Judah and in Israel. And the one prize city, Jerusalem, the capital, the one he should have defeated, there's no mention either by him or anywhere else of him ever capturing Jerusalem, just as the Bible mentions. They've also found royal seals belonging to King Hezekiah, stating Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah. Now, the last thing I want to share with you, and this isn't meant to offend anybody, but I do want to share with you how the Bible, being proved archaeologically, is significant. There are other books out there that claim to be accurate historical records from a divine being. And one of those books is called the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith, the leader or the founder of the Mormon Church, says that the Book of Mormon is the most correct of any book upon earth. But does it withstand the archaeological tests as the Bible does? And the answer is no. No Book of Mormon cities have ever been located. No Book of Mormon person, place, nation, or name has ever been found. No Book of Mormon artifacts, no Book of Mormon scriptures, no Book of Mormon inscriptions, nothing which demonstrates the Book of Mormon is anything other than a myth or invention has ever been found. And I say that not to offend anybody, but I do say that just so that you can see the significance of all the archaeological discoveries that are found regarding the Bible. It's a historical book, a book that can be trusted. The Bible has been proven true archaeologically, as archaeology has shown that the people, the places, the events, the artifacts, the historical time frames, the list of kings, the list of battles, social customs, prices of slaves, covenants, they all match the archaeological record. The Bible is historically reliable. It's trustworthy. You can trust what the Bible records about people, places, and events that occurred. But what about the miracles recorded in the Bible? What do we do about those? Well, you have several options. You can believe that the miracles are mythology that's been crept in over thousands of years. But as we've seen, we don't have thousands of years for myths to creep into the Bible, because the Bible was written at the time that the events took place. You could also believe that the authors purposefully lied about the information they put in the Bible. But if the authors purposefully lied about the information, you should find embellishments about the major heroes in the Bible, things that make the major heroes look better than they really were. But instead, you have a description of the errors, the problems, and all of the failures of the major heroes in the Bible. Third, your third option is the authors were deluded or insane. This is not likely because the Bible is so coherent, so accurate, so well put together, which leads us to the fourth option. And that option is that the authors faithfully recorded what they saw and what they heard. If the Bible really is reliable in all that it teaches, then maybe we can trust what it has to say about God, about humanity's purpose for existence, and about the ultimate meaning of life. Tonight, I'd like to suggest that the evidence shows us that the Bible is not like other books with myths and legends. It's an accurate, historical, and relevant book for our lives today. You can trust what you read in the Bible. Science, archaeology, and history back you up.